This is lesson 24.2, Global Migration around 1900. How was massive migration an integral part of Western expansion? College Board Topic 7.6, New Imperialism, Motivations and Methods. Explain the motivations that led to European imperialism in the period from 1815 to 1914. And of course, we've seen that already. European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. The search for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, as well as strategic and nationalistic considerations, drove Europeans to colonize Africa and Asia, even as European colonies in the Americas broke free politically, if not economically, and then European imperialists justified overseas expansion and rule by claiming cultural and racial superiority. So all of these things are going to kind of play into what the regular person does and the way the regular person emigrates or immigrates. Places? Everywhere. Time? About 1900. Key concepts of global migration: positivism, the migration chain, emigration and immigration, exclusion laws, and global mass migration. Intro. We've talked about Western expansion in terms of governments and investors and manufacturers and merchants and commissioners and ships and soldiers. But perhaps the greatest impact on non-Western parts of the world were not any of those things. They were the millions of regular people like you and me who left Europe, went somewhere else, some of whom became our ancestors. They were not interested in imperialism. They were looking for personal opportunities. They were looking for a future for themselves and for their children. The pressure of population. From 1800 to 1900, the population of Europe more than doubled. Population went from 188 million to 432 million, and this was in spite of the fact that 60 million more people on top of that left Europe during roughly the same time. Europeans, as a percentage of world population, went from 24% to 38%. There was only so much land available in Europe to farmers. There were only so many jobs available to workers. And this population explosion created huge pressures to seek other opportunities outside Europe. European emigration was driven by a combination of factors: a completed agricultural revolution, a lagging industrial development. Industrialized countries can absorb a lot of population growth by putting people to work. Less industrialized countries cannot do that, so a high proportion of the population leaves. Three important patterns to understand about European emigration. Number one, emigration really ramped up from the end of the 19th century to World War I. Number two, people were leaving different parts of Europe at different times. Rates mirrored the socioeconomic conditions of the various European countries. People left Britain and Ireland in large numbers from the 1840s on. The British Empire gave these British emigrants preferential treatment over other European immigrants. German immigration declined after the 1880s because industrialization was able to provide more jobs after that. More and more people left Italy right up until World War I. It had less industry. It also had poorer living standards. And the third thing to understand is less than half of European immigrants went to the United States. European emigration. This was the typical European immigrant, the small, energetic farmer hampered by limited land availability, or the skilled artisan whose competition was cheap manufactured products. This was not the typical European immigrant, people losing their land, or city factory workers. Many Europeans simply moved from one European country to another European country, Irish to Great Britain, or Russians and Poles to Germany, or Spanish and Portuguese and Italians to France. Many were migrants rather than actual immigrants. 1 out of 3 people who came to America went back to Europe, never intending to stay. 1 out of 2 people did the same thing in Argentina. Many would harvest wheat half the year in the northern hemisphere and the other half of the year in the southern hemisphere. They could double their income this way because they had more working days per year. and global transportation was becoming that cheap. Many European immigrants were frustrated by the lack of rights in Europe. Many were frustrated by the power of the privileged classes. Many Jews left places where their human rights were trampled upon. Emigration tended to slow in places where people won things like basic political and social reforms, equality before the law, the right to vote, Social Security. The migration chain. Many immigrants had family and friendship ties to other immigrants, and these often settled in the same communities abroad. For example, so many Ukrainians moving to Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. Brighton Beach reminded them of Odessa. Often a prominent community member would blaze the trail to a new destination, and then many from that same community would follow him. And this would form a migration chain to that new location. Asian emigration. 3 million Asians had moved all over the world by 1920. Destinations were Latin America, Africa, California, Hawaii, and Australia. And they often worked in plantations or mines. White plantation owners often hired Asians to replace outlawed slave labor. 130,000 Chinese went to Cuba. 100,000 Chinese went to Peru. Conditions were often slave-like. Many Asians left their, quote, employment as soon as they could. By the 1880s, many countries had stopped the inflow of Asians with exclusion laws. The reasoning for exclusion laws was driven by three things: nationalism, scientific racism, and nativism. Nativism means giving preference to established inhabitants when choosing who can come to the country and who can't. France, Germany, and the U.S. all practice nativism in their immigration policies. Nativism altered world migration patterns. The acceptable people had much more freedom to migrate to the various Neo-Europes around the world than Asians and Africans. By 1913, Neo-Europes like Australia, Canada, and the U.S. had some of the highest per capita incomes in the world. These had rich resources, these had lots of available land, and they had good, familiar climates. These areas were far more accessible to white Europeans than to Asians or Africans.